Congresswoman Omar, do you cherish the nation that granted you sanctuary? The Senate hearing chamber fell into a heavy stillness, broken only by the rhythmic hum of recording equipment. This was far from the typical performative politics often seen on Capitol Hill. The atmosphere carried the weight of constitutional duty and genuine consequence. Vice President J.D. Vance occupied the presiding chair with a stoic command. He sat with the posture of a Marine, back rigid and hands steady on the mahogany. His eyes held the steel of a man who had witnessed combat and refused to blink. Rising from Appalachian hardship, he had clawed his way to success through grit. Behind him stood the flag he had once protected in foreign deserts. Across from him sat Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, his contemporary but from a different world. She had arrived as a child refugee escaping the horrors of civil conflict. Now a prominent figure of the progressive left, she was known for her sharp critiques of American policy. Surrounded by a team of legal counsel, she adjusted her headscarf with a palpable tension. Her defensive body language suggested she was bracing for a siege. The official docket listed immigration and finance irregularities, but the room sensed a deeper trial was underway. Vance retrieved a single aged sheet of paper from his folder. It was the refugee application filed when she was merely 12 years old. This was the paperwork that had literally saved her life and brought her to these shores. Congresswoman, America rescued you from war and welcomed you when you possessed nothing. We provided safety, education, and the path to the seat you now hold. He displayed the document for the cameras, letting the image resonate with the audience. You now enjoy a life of significant wealth and wield immense political power. He placed the paper deliberately on the table between them as a silent testament. I have a fundamental inquiry that should be simple for a beneficiary of such generosity. Fixing her with an unyielding gaze, he asked the question that would define the proceedings. Congresswoman, is there love in your heart for the country that saved you? The resulting silence was suffocating because they both understood the danger of an honest answer. Please support this channel as we witness a veteran confront a representative with the ultimate test of loyalty. The energy in the room shifted away from standard oversight into something far more intense. This was not about partisan bickering, but about constitutional accountability. Vance was utilizing his full authority to lead this inquiry personally. Backed by the executive branch, he held the power of subpoena and criminal referral. Republicans had long sought answers regarding the allegations of fraud surrounding Omar. Democrats had spent years shielding her, dismissing inquiries as motivated by prejudice. But Vance operated with the singular focus of a mission-oriented Marine. The visual dichotomy of the chamber told the story before a word was spoken. The vice president's desk was arranged with military precision, featuring stacks of verified evidence. Marriage licenses, tax filings, and DNA analysis offers were organized like a prosecutor's case file. Behind him, Republican senators sat in stony silence, aware of the verified intelligence he possessed. This was not speculation, but a documented timeline of alleged deception. The American flag stood sentinel behind Vance, a symbol of the values he cherished. Conversely, the opposing table resembled a mobilized legal defense unit. Attorneys from various advocacy groups flanked the Congresswoman, ready to object. Supporters in the gallery prepared to label any difficult questioning as an attack on her identity. The Progressive Coalition had arrived in force to stand against the proceedings. Prepared statements about discrimination glowed on their tablet screens. The narrative of victimhood was primed for immediate deployment at the first sign of pressure. Omar's press team huddled in the back, drafting social media responses to deflect the accusations. The deflection machine was fully operational and running at high speed. Omar herself sat with a guarded expression she had perfected over years of controversy. She adjusted her covering nervously, a tell that investigators noted appeared when she felt trapped. She wore her identity like armor against the coming barrage of evidence. Yet, facing her was a man who had known poverty deeper than she had experienced in America. He was a combat veteran who had defended the very nation she frequently criticized. He was indifferent to name-calling because he was armed with the truth. This hearing was not about religion, but about alleged fraud and betrayal of public trust. The gallery was overflowing, packed with media representatives and curious onlookers. Conservative outlets were present to document the questions they had asked for years. Even the mainstream press could not ignore a vice president investigating a sitting member of Congress. Democrats in the room shifted uncomfortably, bound by party loyalty but dreading the exposure. They knew privately that defending the indefensible would be a political liability. Many had quietly wished for an end to the inflammatory statements that plagued their party. The committee chairman brought the room to order with a brief statement on integrity. He then immediately yielded the floor to the vice president for the inquiry. Vance dispensed with the usual Washington pleasantries and opened his file. "Congresswoman, let us examine the journey that brought you to this point." He skipped the small talk and went straight to the heart of the mission. He presented the original 1995 asylum request from her childhood. It detailed a family fleeing Somalia and seeking sanctuary in the United States. You arrived at 12, escaping a war zone after years in a Kenyan camp. You had nothing but the clothes on your back and a desperate hope. The screen behind him displayed her childhood photo, capturing the raw vulnerability of a refugee. America answered your plea and granted your family a new existence. You received safety, schooling, and a future that was impossible in your homeland. Images flashed, showing the stark contrast between a war-torn ruin and an American suburb. You became a citizen and attended college on taxpayer-funded scholarships. You entered the political arena and won a seat in the United States Congress. Current photos showed Omar in designer attire, working from a well-appointed office. The transformation from a destitute refugee to a wealthy politician was complete. You now reside in a luxury home, and your family benefits from lucrative consulting contracts. He let the weight of that statement settle over the room. It was a complete metamorphosis from having nothing to possessing millions. Before addressing the specific charges, I must establish a baseline of gratitude. Vance spoke with the moral authority of someone who had earned his citizenship through sacrifice. "Congresswoman, do you love the country that saved you?" The question hung in the air like the lingering smoke of a fired round. It was simple, direct, and utterly devastating in its implication. Omar's legal team leaned in to whisper urgent advice. They had prepared for legal technicalities, but not for a challenge to her character. This inquiry struck at the foundation of her political identity. She turned to the microphone, her defensive mask slipping firmly into place. "Mr. Vice President, I hold a deep respect for the Constitution and our values. I did not ask about legal documents, I asked about the nation itself. Do you love the country that rescued you from a war zone?" "I believe in the ideals we strive for." She deflected again. "That is not an answer to the question I asked. Yes or no, do you love America?" Her attorney attempted to interject, claiming the question was irrelevant. Vance silenced him with a sharp gesture and returned his focus to the witness. "The country saved your life, so the answer should be easy." The silence that followed was damning, because the truth was palpable. Every critique she had ever leveled against the United States now echoed in the quiet room. Her history of minimizing threats against America suggested a painful answer. She did not love the country, or her way of showing it was indistinguishable from disdain. Vance allowed the silence to stretch, making her refusal to answer scream louder than words. We will return to that fundamental issue of gratitude later in this session. Everything we discuss today flows from whether you appreciate what this nation gave you. He opened the next dossier, revealing a systematic pattern of alleged deceit. Let us begin the examination of the evidence. The Marine who loved his country was about to dissect the record of the refugee who seemed to loathe it. Everyone present understood that the conclusion of this hearing would be pivotal. Vance did not ease into the subject matter with gentle preliminaries. He applied the military principle of engaging a target directly and without hesitation. Congresswoman, let us discuss your marital history in detail. The tension in the room spiked as the most controversial allegation was placed on the table. He produced a chronological array of marriage certificates and divorce decrees. The timeline he presented was riddled with inconsistencies and overlapping dates. You have navigated a complex web of marriages and separations. There are overlapping tax returns and immigration benefits that appear at convenient moments. These documents raise serious questions about federal fraud. Omar's lead attorney immediately leaned forward to object to the line of questioning. Mr. Vice President, these define baseless internet conspiracies that have been debunked. Nothing has been debunked. That is merely a talking point you use to deflect. Vance's voice was hard, unimpressed by the legal maneuvering. Fact-checkers stating they cannot prove a negative is not the same as exoneration. I have evidence that we will review systematically while the Congresswoman is under oath. He projected a graphic onto the screen, laying out the timeline visually. We are here to determine if this is a story of gratitude or criminal fraud. The first document displayed was a religious marriage certificate from 2002. You entered a faith-based union with Ahmed Abdi Salan Hersi. Although not registered with the state, it was recognized by your community. Photos appeared showing the couple as young parents starting a life together. In 2008, you separated, but without a legal marriage, there was no legal divorce. Then, in 2009, the paperwork tells a very strange story. A new marriage certificate appeared for a man named Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. You legally married this man, marking your first official union registered with the state. Vance held up the document to ensure the cameras captured the names. Congresswoman, significant evidence suggests that this man is your biological brother. The room went electric as the accusation was spoken aloud in the Senate. Evidence suggests this was a marriage entered into for fraudulent purposes. Records from the United Kingdom indicate that you share the same father. The name on the official documents matches your own lineage. Vance proceeded to the second point of evidence, displaying archived social media posts. Deleted screenshots showed the man referring to your children as his nieces and nephews. Why would your husband refer to your children as his nieces unless he is their uncle? Vance read the captions aloud, highlighting the familial terms used. High school records from Minnesota placed all three of you in the same household. The yearbook listed Elmi under your father's name, not as a separate family. Immigration records show he struggled to enter the U.S. until he married a citizen. A marriage to a U.S. national provides a much faster pathway than other methods. Vance presented a document offering a simple solution to the controversy. A standard DNA test could conclusively prove or disprove this relationship within a week. You have been offered this opportunity multiple times and have always refused. Vance locked eyes with her, demanding an answer to the refusal. Why will you not take a test that would clear your name immediately? Her attorney began to protest, but Vance cut him off again. I am asking the witness why she refuses to exonerate herself. Will you submit to DNA testing to prove he is not your brother? I will not dignify these attacks with a response, she replied coldly. So the answer is no. You refuse to provide the one piece of evidence that matters. Vance let the refusal hang in the air as proof in itself. Let me explain why this matters to every legal immigrant in this country. Immigration fraud is not a victimless clerical error. Millions of Americans are waiting years to bring their loved ones here legally. I know Marines whose interpreters are hunted while they wait for visas. Cutting the line through a sham marriage insults everyone who follows the law. It is a federal crime punishable by prison and deportation. He highlighted the timeline of benefits the man received after the marriage. Once married, he qualified for financial aid and tuition assistance. For years, he utilized these benefits while legally bound to you. In 2017, after he had finished his education, you divorced him. You immediately remarried the man you had been with the entire time. The timeline suggests a transaction rather than a relationship. It appears you married for benefits and divorced once they were secured. Congresswoman, did you marry your brother to defraud the United States government? She repeated that the allegations were rooted in prejudice. I served with Muslims, so do not hide behind religion to avoid a legal question. Did you commit this crime to cheat the immigration system? She refused to answer, continuing to deflect toward claims of racism. Her attorneys scribbled frantically, trying to find a way out of the corner. Vance moved seamlessly to the next folder containing tax records. Even if he is not your brother, you face the issue of tax fraud. You filed joint tax returns with one man while legally married to another. The IRS documents on the screen showed the filing status clearly. You claimed to be married to a man you were not legally wed to. That constitutes filing false federal tax returns, which is a crime. The IRS is concerned with legal status, not religious or cultural unions. You have already paid fines to the state for these specific violations. You claimed they were mistakes, but you are a legislator who understands the law. Filing as married to the wrong person for 2 years is not a simple typo. Is this how you show gratitude? By defrauding the tax system? America took you in, and you repaid that act by cheating on your taxes. Vance stacked the evidence of the marriage scheme neatly on his desk. The summary of the allegations painted a picture of calculated exploitation. You allegedly married a sibling, filed false taxes, and refused DNA evidence. You maintained the charade until the benefits were exhausted. Then you returned to your actual partner once the fraud was complete. That is not love, Congresswoman. That is a criminal enterprise. It is a systematic pattern of cheating the very system that saved you. Do you love this country because defrauding it is a strange way to show it? Vance closed the folder, signaling the end of that specific line of questioning. Omar's attorneys looked relieved, unaware that the financial inquiry was next. Let us discuss the millions paid to your third husband's firm. He displayed photos of her current spouse and the timeline of their relationship. In 2018, he was married to another woman with a child. Your campaign hired his consulting firm for strategy and fundraising. In 2019, his wife filed for divorce, alleging an affair with you. The court filings explicitly stated he was in love with Ilhan Omar. He left his family for you, and you subsequently married him. You did this while paying his firm staggering amounts of campaign money. Vance recited the figures, which totaled over $3 million. This money flowed from donors to your campaign and then to your husband. The average campaign spends a fraction of that amount on consulting. You paid 10 times the normal rate to a firm owned by your partner. FEC rules strictly prohibit the personal use of campaign funds. Paying millions to a romantic partner looks like personal enrichment. You have already paid fines for similar violations in Minnesota. $3 million cannot be dismissed as a bookkeeping error. You earn a congressional salary, yet you live like a millionaire. Your lifestyle far exceeds what your official income should support. You arrived as a refugee with nothing and now live in luxury. Where did the wealth come from if not these questionable payments? Donors believe they are supporting a cause, not buying you a mansion. It appears you are using campaign funds as a personal piggy bank. Is this gratitude, or is this financial fraud? America gave you opportunity, and you seem to be laundering money through it. Omar claimed the services were legitimate and valuable to her success. You won your district by 40 points and did not need such expensive consulting. Expert affidavits state the payments are highly unusual and suspicious. If the work was real, provide the itemized billing records now. She conferred with her counsel and refused to produce the documents. You will not prove the work was legitimate because the records likely do not exist. You simply claim legality while hiding the evidence. Vance's expression hardened as he shifted to the topic of ideology. This was no longer about money, but about dangerous rhetoric. Let us discuss your history of anti-Semitic statements. He produced a collection of her tweets and public comments. You famously claimed that support for Israel was all about the money. The implication was that Jewish loyalty is purchased, a classic slur. When challenged, you doubled down on the conspiracy theory. You invoked the ancient trope that Jewish people control the world with currency. This is the language of hate groups, spoken by a member of Congress. You have questioned the loyalty of Jewish Americans to this country. Suggesting dual loyalty is another cornerstone of anti-Semitic thought. You have drawn moral equivalencies between democracies and terrorist groups. After the horrific attacks by Hamas, you refused to condemn the terrorists. You called for a ceasefire while ignoring the atrocities committed against civilians. Jewish Americans feel unsafe because leaders like you fuel the fire. Hate crimes against the Jewish community have skyrocketed during your tenure. Your words grant permission for others to express their hatred. Prominent leaders in your own party have had to condemn your language. Even they recognized that your statements were dangerous and bigoted. Do you love the country that saved you, or do you prefer to spread division? Spreading hatred against a minority group is a contradiction of American values. Vance then turned to her comments regarding the attacks of September 11th. He played a video clip of her speaking to a civil rights group. You described the worst terror attack in our history as some people did something. The minimization of that day was breathtaking in its callousness. 19 terrorists murdered 3,000 innocent Americans. It was an act of war, not a minor incident to be brushed aside. Vance recounted the devastation of the towers and the heroism of the first responders. Families were destroyed, and the nation was scarred forever. Yet, you could not bring yourself to name the ideology responsible. You described mass murder with the casual tone of a traffic accident. You consistently minimized terrorism while criticizing the American response. After every attack, you focus on the backlash rather than the victims. You struggle to condemn Islamic terrorism without adding a qualification. I served in Iraq and saw the cost of that ideology firsthand. I know what terrorism looks like, and you seem to sympathize with it. Do you love this country because you sound like you are apologizing for its enemies? Vance paused, taking a breath before the final personal segment. He returned to the refugee application, the document of her salvation. I want to read the words you wrote when you were begging for entry. You described a family fleeing violence and fearing for their lives. You asked America for sanctuary from persecution and death. America said yes and opened its doors to you. You left a place of ruins and came to a land of peace. You were given food, safety, and an education paid for by taxpayers. You were given the chance to rise from a camp to the capital. You achieved the American dream in its most spectacular form. And how have you repaid this extraordinary generosity? A compilation of her critical statements played on the screens. You call America racist, oppressive, and unjust at every opportunity. You paint the country that saved you as the villain of the world. Compare this nation to the one you fled, where women have no voice. Compare it to regimes where dissent is punished with death. You escaped real oppression to live in the freest nation on earth. I grew up in poverty, but I learned to love this country through service. I defended it because I understood its value. You were given a gift, and you treat it with utter contempt. Real gratitude looks like the Vietnamese refugees who kiss the ground. It looks like the Cubans who cherish their freedom from tyranny. It looks like the interpreters who weep with joy when they arrive. They do not spend their lives attacking the host that saved them. Your behavior is not gratitude. It is a profound betrayal. Vance returned to his seat, his voice dropping to a serious register. Congresswoman, I ask you one last time, do you love America? She attempted to speak about ideals and the Constitution again. He cut her off, demanding a response about the nation itself. You cannot say the words because they contradict your political brand. Your career is built on the premise that America is the problem. Admitting you love it would destroy the persona you have created. Is this gratitude or is this a long con? Vance gathered his files, the weight of the evidence undeniable. We have seen the marriage records, the tax fraud, and the campaign payments. We have heard the hateful rhetoric and the minimization of terror. The pattern is consistent, and the conclusion is clear. You allegedly defrauded the government that gave you refuge. You enriched yourself while criticizing the system that made you wealthy. You offer contempt instead of thanks to the American people. You are not a victim. You are a beneficiary who refuses to say thank you. You represent the worst kind of entitlement. I earned my place through service, while you seemingly cheated your way to yours. You are the ungrateful recipient of a miracle. The question remains, is this gratitude or is this fraud? Her silence was the only answer the room needed. It was fraud, wrapped in the rhetoric of social justice. Vance formally recommended investigations into immigration, tax, and campaign violations. He called for DNA testing to settle the incest allegation once and for all. He suggested that revocation of citizenship was on the table if fraud was proven. The hearing adjourned, leaving the ungrateful narrative in tatters. Vance had exposed the rot of victimhood politics for the world to see. He demonstrated that being a refugee does not grant immunity from the law. Merit and gratitude must matter more than identity and grievance. The Marine had won the day, and the truth was laid bare. The gavel struck the mahogany-sounding block with a finality that seemed to echo through the history books. The committee room, previously held in a suspended state of tension, instantly dissolved into chaotic motion. Reporters scrambled over the press barriers, shouting questions that merged into a wall of noise. Congresswoman Omar did not linger to offer sound bites or defiant gestures to the cameras. She gathered her binders with trembling hands and exited through the side door, her legal team forming a protective phalanx around her. Vice President Vance remained seated for a moment, methodically closing the thick dossiers of evidence. He did not smile or engage in a victory lap, maintaining the solemn demeanor of an officer who had just completed a necessary but unpleasant duty. The contrast between the fleeing representative and the steady veteran was the defining image of the day. Outside in the corridor, the deflection machine was already attempting to spin the disaster. Progressive strategists were frantically emailing talking points to friendly media outlets, trying to reframe the hearing as a partisan attack. But the atmosphere in Washington had fundamentally shifted, and the old tactics were failing to gain traction. The clip of Omar refusing the DNA test was already circulating globally, garnering millions of views in minutes. It was the one moment that no amount of political spin could explain away. An innocent person simply takes the test and ends the speculation forever. Her refusal was being interpreted by the court of public opinion as a tacit admission of guilt. Cable news anchors struggled to contextualize the hearing, their usual narratives crumbling under the weight of the documents Vance had presented. They wanted to talk about tone and decorum, but the audience was fixated on the hard evidence of fraud. The visual of the marriage timeline and the tax returns had been seared into the national consciousness. For the first time, the squad looked vulnerable, their armor of identity politics pierced by cold, hard facts. Back in the secure offices of the Capitol, a panic was setting in among the progressive coalition. They realized that Vance had introduced a new rule of engagement: receipts over rhetoric. The usual cries of racism had bounced off a man who grew up in poverty and served in combat. They could not shame him, so they had no defense against him. The realization that the Department of Justice might actually act on the criminal referrals hung over them like a storm cloud. This was no longer just a political problem, it was a potential legal catastrophe. Vance emerged from the hearing room to face a battery of microphones, his expression unchanged. He did not raise his voice or engage in hyperbole when the first questions were shouted. "The American people deserve the truth," he stated simply, looking directly into the lens. "If laws were broken, there must be consequences, regardless of a person's title or background." He walked past the baiting questions from partisan reporters, moving with the confidence of a man who held all the cards. The fallout was immediate and severe as the implications of the testimony began to sink in. Legal analysts appeared on screen, admitting that the tax fraud allegations carried mandatory prison time if proven. The immigration fraud charges were even more serious, carrying the distinct possibility of denaturalization. For years, the threat of deportation had been dismissed as a right-wing fantasy. Now, with the vice president formally requesting it based on evidence, it became a terrifying possibility. Social media platforms were ablaze with the ungrateful refugee narrative, a label that stuck because the footage supported it. Americans shared stories of their own immigrant ancestors who loved the flag and followed the rules. The juxtaposition of their gratitude against Omar's resentment created a powerful cultural current. It was a rejection of the idea that America is evil, led by a man who had fought to defend it. The silence from the Democratic leadership was deafening. They knew this was a losing battle. Privately, senior party officials were distancing themselves, sensing that Omar had become a toxic asset. They could defend policy disagreements, but they could not defend marrying a sibling to defraud the government. The investigation had forced them to choose between political solidarity and the rule of law. By the end of the news cycle, it was clear they were choosing survival. Omar was being left alone on an island of her own making. In the days that followed, the machinery of the federal government began to turn with ominous precision. The Department of Homeland Security announced a formal review of the file Vance had highlighted. The IRS signaled that the tax returns in question were being pulled for a forensic audit. These were not political gestures, they were the grinding gears of bureaucracy reacting to evidence of a crime. The shield of congressional privilege does not extend to felonies committed before taking office. The squad members who had sat in the gallery were now noticeably quiet, scrubbing their own social media histories. They understood that if the standard was now proven integrity, they were all at risk. Vance had not just exposed one politician, he had shattered the illusion of their moral superiority. The narrative that they were the virtuous victims fighting an evil system had collapsed. They were revealed as part of the corrupt establishment, enriching themselves while preaching socialism. As the investigation deepened, the focus remained on the simple, haunting question Vance had asked. Do you love the country that saved you? It became a litmus test for a nation tired of being told it was inherently bad. The public was rallying around the idea that citizenship is a privilege, not a right to be abused. The ungrateful refugee had awakened a sleeping giant of patriotism. The story was no longer about Ilhan Omar. It was about the restoration of American standards. It was about the demand that those who write the laws must also obey them. It was a declaration that the era of the double standard was coming to a close. J.D. Vance had proven that courage is contagious. By standing up to the bully of victimhood, he gave permission for the rest of the country to do the same. The inevitable conclusion was approaching, not with a bang, but with the steady stroke of a pen on legal indictments. The fraud was too documented, the lies too public, and the betrayal too deep. America is a forgiving nation, but it does not forgive ingratitude coupled with criminality. The road ahead promised legal battles, but the moral verdict had already been delivered. The Marine had secured the objective, and the integrity of the nation was the prize. The strategic silence from the Department of Justice did not last long, and when it broke, it was not with a press release, but with the sterile, terrifying efficiency of a federal subpoena. 2 weeks after the hearing, federal marshals arrived at the district office in Minneapolis, bypassing the protesters and the cameras to deliver a court order that no amount of political spin could deflect. The document was specific, sweeping, and legally binding, demanding the immediate surrender of unredacted financial records from the E Street Group, and, more crucially, a court-ordered DNA sample to resolve the question of sibling lineage once and for all. Congresswoman Omar attempted to regain the offensive on the steps of the Capitol, flanked by the dwindling remnants of her political coalition. She spoke with the fiery cadence that had once galvanized her base, framing the investigation as a weaponized assault on diversity and dissent. She called the vice president a tyrant, and the investigation a witch hunt designed to silence a woman of color. In years past, this rhetoric would have been sufficient to rally the media and force a retreat, but the landscape had fundamentally changed. Reporters who had previously acted as stenographers for her talking points were now armed with the data Vance had placed into the public record. When she paused for applause, a correspondent from a major network shouted a question that cut through the prepared remarks. "Congresswoman, will you comply with the DNA subpoena to prove your innocence, or are you filing a motion to quash it?" The question hung in the humid D.C. air, stripping away the layer of victimhood she had tried to wrap around herself. Her refusal to answer, followed by a hasty retreat to her vehicle, was broadcast live, serving as a visual confirmation of the public's growing suspicion. From his office in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, Vice President Vance watched the spectacle with the dispassionate gaze of a tactician observing an opponent's desperate final maneuver. He understood that the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. Now, the court of law was beginning its methodical work. He had not engaged in a shouting match. He had simply unlocked the door and let the evidence walk in. The narrative was no longer about a feud between a Republican and a Democrat. It was about the cold, hard reality of forensic accounting and biological truth. The IRS audit, triggered by the discrepancies Vance highlighted, was moving with unusual speed, fueled by the clarity of the evidence. Investigators were unraveling the complex web of transfers between the campaign coffers and the consulting firm, tracing dollar for dollar how donor money had transmuted into personal lifestyle upgrades. The forensic accountants were not interested in ideology or identity. They cared only about the math, and the math was painting a picture of deliberate, systemic tax evasion. The mistakes Omar had previously claimed were being reclassified as willful intent, a legal distinction that bridges the gap between a fine and a felony indictment. Simultaneously, the political firewall that had protected the squad began to crumble from the inside. Democratic leadership, reading the internal polling data, realized that the ungrateful refugee narrative was toxic in swing districts. They could not afford to be the party that defended marriage fraud and tax evasion in the name of solidarity. Quietly, through back channels, the message was sent to Omar's team that the protection racket was over. There would be no filibuster to save her, no party line vote to block expulsion if the Ethics Committee returned a guilty verdict. She was being cut loose to save the ship. The pressure intensified when a leak from the Department of Homeland Security suggested that the naturalization file from 2000 was indeed being reviewed for material misrepresentation. This was the nuclear option. If it was proven that she gained entry or citizenship through fraudulent means, specifically by lying about her family status or name, her citizenship itself was null and void ab initio from the beginning. It meant she was not just a congresswoman in trouble, she was potentially an unauthorized alien illegally holding federal office. The irony was bitter and absolute. The system she despised was now the only thing keeping her in the country, and its patience was exhausted. Desperation began to manifest in erratic behavior. Her social media accounts vacillated between wild accusations of conspiracy and strange philosophical posts about persecution. Her legal team filed emergency motions to halt the DNA testing, arguing it was an invasion of privacy, a move that legal scholars noted was essentially a confession. Innocent people do not fight to hide the truth, they fight to reveal it. By blocking the test, she confirmed what the timeline suggested. The man she married was the brother she denied. Vance remained the steady hand on the tiller, refusing to gloat, but refusing to relent. In a quiet interview, he framed the issue not as a conquest, but as a necessary correction. "We cannot have a two-tiered system of justice," he explained, "where a Marine is court-martialed for a minor infraction, but a Congresswoman can rewrite her own history and defraud the taxpayer with impunity." His words resonated because they tapped into a deep, simmering anger among the working class. The feeling that the elites played by a different set of rules. The climax of this phase arrived when the House Ethics Committee, emboldened by the Vice President's findings, announced they were bypassing their usual glacial pace. They scheduled a formal vote on a resolution of inquiry, the first step toward expulsion. It was a bipartisan signal that the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. The halls of Congress, usually buzzing with noise, grew quiet whenever Omar passed. She was walking like a ghost, a politician who was already gone but hadn't yet left the building. As the subpoena deadline approached, the options narrowed to a singularity. She could submit to the test and face the scientific proof of her deception, or she could defy the federal court and face immediate contempt charges and incarceration. The trap Vance had set was inescapable, because it was built on her own actions. There was no way out, no racism card left to play, no deflection that could stop the momentum of the law. The final blow to her defense came not from the government, but from her own community. Leaders within the Somali-American diaspora in Minnesota began to speak out, tired of their reputation being tarnished by her scandals. They gave interviews expressing their love for America, distancing themselves from her anti-American rhetoric. They dismantled her shield of identity politics by showing that she did not represent them. She represented only her own ambition and greed. The ungrateful refugee was now isolated even from the people she claimed to champion. Night fell over Washington, but the lights in the Department of Justice remained burning. The indictments were being drafted, the timelines finalized, the case sealed. The era of impunity was over. J.D. Vance had pulled the thread, and the entire tapestry of lies was unraveling, leaving Ilhan Omar standing alone in the wreckage of her own making, waiting for the knock on the door that would end the charade forever.